Hello and welcome to the Week 23 video. We've got three figures that we're going to be discussing this week, and I will be getting a quiz together at some point, so I know you're sitting on pins and needles for that. I will take care of that at some point here. But again, we chronologically have moved from the Dark Ages into the early medieval period, but you'll hear a lot of the same problems or issues that we talked about really for the past month or so kind of rear their heads again here as we get roughly into the 13th century. Frederick II is the first figure we're going to talk about today. He was Holy Roman Emperor, and the phrase associated with him was stupor mundi, which means the amazement of the world. We'll talk about how he got that label attached to him. He technically became the Holy Roman Emperor, that is, the leader of the Holy Roman Empire, when he was only 2 years old, because his father died, and this was a hereditary title at the time. Of course, that meant a regent was going to be directing the affairs of the Holy Roman Empire until Frederick came of age. When he was just 5, his mother died as well. But in her will, she asked the Pope Innocent III, whom we talked about a bit last week, to be the guardian and educator and protector of her son while he grew up. You'd think a pope would be a trustworthy dude to leave your kids with, but as we found out, Frederick was more or less neglected. He was brought to the Vatican and basically left to fend for himself. At times he was living on the streets in poverty, begging for food, but he did manage to take advantage of his situation somewhat insofar as he was educated, and by the time he was 12 he could speak 9 languages. Very sharp intellect. By the age of 15, he assumed the emperorship of the Holy Roman Empire, and he got married. And the Pope, of course, even though he was not the best father figure, he was very fond of Frederick, and of course used this very close connection he had with the Holy Roman Emperor to make all kinds of advantageous deals. Again, that separation between the crown and the cross becoming very, very blurred. Now, getting back to Frederick, again, as you could probably discern from his childhood, he was pretty sharp intellectually, and he was very bullish on education, particularly higher education. He founded the University of Naples and the University of Salerno, two Italian universities that are still around today and have produced some of the great philosophy of the Middle Ages. Again, after Pope Innocent died, a new pope was named, and they began to have some of the same issues with Frederick as prior popes had with other Holy Roman emperors. Remember when the Pope crowned Charlemagne in the year 800 as the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire? And remember the later investiture controversy where the Pope asserted a right to make all the church appointments, but the king at the time made his own statement that he was the one. Again, the crown or the cross, the big result of that is what? We talked about it before. Confusion. Who do we follow? Over here is the Pope and the church and all the power that implies. Over here is the emperor with the military and all the power that implies. You were kind of in a stasis period now. Again, it really clouded the matter. Who do we listen to here? In the year 1215, when Frederick was only 21, he was, of course, at the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire at this point. Pope Innocent III, the one that was his guardian from a time back, held the Fourth Lateran Council. And during this gathering of archbishops, priests, and whatnot, they came to the conclusion, reestablishing the Pope as the highest authority in the land, higher even than kings, higher even than the Holy Roman Emperor. Well, of course the Pope is going to think that. At that time, Pope Innocent III, like we said, did not have any specific beef with Frederick, but Pope Innocent III died, and the popes after him really did have a beef with Frederick. The popes following Innocent, of course, had no emotional attachment to Frederick, and they struggled to rein him in. In addition to being a scholar, Frederick II was very much prone to doing his own thing, whether or not the church endorsed it or not. Pope Gregory IX was the immediate successor to Innocent III, and they had a heated conflict involving, you guessed it, another doggone crusade, where Frederick would eventually crown himself as King of Jerusalem. And of course, as you would expect, a pope says that's kind of my thing to do. In the year 1220, the Fifth Crusade was well underway and was not going well. Frederick was partly to blame because he did not send the help that he promised to send. He vowed, did Frederick, to launch a sixth crusade and to lead it himself, and to sort of sweeten the pot a little bit. He married an heiress to the throne of Jerusalem. His first wife had died. And so without bloodshed, Frederick was able to sign a peace treaty with the Muslim Sultan of the region, and he gained control of several regions, including most of Jerusalem, but not the Dome of the Rock, the church there in the center of Jerusalem, which has been the center of so much history. Again, Saladin turned it into a mosque, and of course the Jewish people saw that as the site of the temple that the Romans destroyed. So, yeah. So the year 1227, Frederick led the Sixth Crusade. The Pope, because the Pope was not brought in on any of this, had Frederick excommunicated from the church. So Gregory said, since you're not part of the church, you're not allowed to lead any crusade. Well, Frederick said that's fine. He went on and launched the crusade on his own. And of course, this made the Pope look like a fool. Popes don't like that. And again, his marriage, by which he claimed the throne of Jerusalem, his wife died a year after he married her. So technically, his infant son that his wife had was the heir to the throne of Jerusalem, and not him. Frederick ignored that and crowned himself king of Jerusalem in 1229. That was a very unpopular move with the people. Again, you remember the investiture controversy where it was the people who ultimately sort of sided with the Pope because he excommunicated the emperor? Kind of the same thing happened here. There was a lot of public backlash against Frederick II for declaring himself king of Jerusalem. The other reason that the Pope was upset with all this is, remember the deal he made with the Sultan of Egypt? Well, it was only good for 10 years, and of course it left the Dome of the Rock in Muslim hands. So the Pope was not pleased with any of this. Inexplicably, though, a couple of years later, the Pope Gregory IX, publicly forgave Frederick and aligned with him to defeat something called the Lombard League, an alliance that the Pope had formed. Pope Gregory didn't like Frederick defeating his little army, so to speak, and so he excommunicated him again in 1239. The Pope died in 1241, and Frederick went on actually to, he retired to Sicily, and he ruled the Holy Roman Empire from Sicily. That's the island off the coast of Italy where what looks like the Italian boot is kicking. And all the while, Frederick claimed that he was as important as the Son of God, and that his rule was a divine rule. Of course, the next Pope, Innocent IV, didn't think much of that either. Frederick died in the year 1250. Two of his sons battled over the issue of authority with Pope Innocent IV. Again, the bottom line is this is basically a continuation of what we were talking about earlier with the investiture controversy. Where's the power lie? With the cross or the crown? And the victim, of course, so many millions of people who are wondering, whom should we listen to? So, in that sense, the story of Frederick II is really more of the same. We're going to talk about a couple of big thinkers from the medieval period. Again, we're roughly mid-13th century when we talk about Thomas Aquinas. he was born into a fairly well-to-do family. He was educated and all that good stuff. He decided to join the Dominican friars. You'll remember from when we talked about Dominic of Spain. As a result, he abandoned his wealth. He put on the white robe made of very cheap material and forewent worldly pursuits. The odd thing was Thomas's family was insulted by this. They literally kidnapped him and kept him a prisoner for 2 years so he would not go and join the Dominican friars. During this time, evidently Thomas's commitment so impressed his mother that she helped him to escape this family prison that he was placed in. Thomas arrived in Paris in the year 1252 and met a scholar by the name of Albertus Magnus, and he began writing down some of his work. Again, he was studying, he had taken the vow of poverty, but he was writing his thoughts down as he went along. Eventually, his journal, his writings, was summed up in something called Summa Theologica. The idea is that he was taking a look at the nature of mankind. Now, again, the idea behind philosophy is not unlike religion insofar as philosophy tries to explain man's place in the universe and the way we behave, the way things happen. Much like religion tries to explain the otherwise unexplainable, philosophy is very much like that. The problem is, during the Dark Ages in particular, when so much of your energy is focused on day-to-day survival, sustenance, and subsistence, you don't have a lot of time for deep thoughts. I mean, certainly we've all been in that situation where we ponder the nature of the universe and all, but philosophy was not something that was very much prized. As a matter of fact, before the Middle Ages, the last great philosophical era was that of the Greeks. And Thomas Aquinas took the thoughts of Aristotle, a Greek philosopher who lived about 300 years before Christ, and worked on some very profound ideas on the nature of mankind. There was a blend to sort of, an attempt, I should say, to sort of blend Aristotle's principles on man with Christianity. And interestingly, he didn't write it, evidently Thomas Aquinas did not write this with this in mind. I mean, this is just something he arrived at. He didn't plan it. But he wrote it not just for Christians, but for Muslims, in an effort to explain Christianity in a way they might understand. Some call it scholasticism, that attempt to explain scholarly pursuits through religion, and it's it's a legitimate field of study. Some call it the marriage of reason and faith. There are a lot of people who even today believe you can't be a truly religious person if you are very intelligent, because your intelligence would force you to look at religion in a negative light. Thomas Aquinas did not believe that. I don't either, for the record. And so he tried, and I think in many ways succeeded in marrying these two ideas, reason, logic, left brain stuff, with faith, the belief in things not seen, which is in some ways the opposite of reason. It was not an easy sell then. It's not an easy sell now to explain the ways of God and man. It's a very deep subject, but Thomas Aquinas in Summa Theologica did a great job of attempting to explain that and to bring really an intellectual level to the church. Just really a step up. Again, when most of your time is spent on trying to stay alive, you're not going to think about these deep thoughts very often. Thomas Aquinas did, and gave a very sound philosophical foundation for what would later be the Age of Reason, demonstrating that logic, science, cause and effect does not preclude Christianity. It does not mean you cannot be a faithful servant of God. Roger Bacon is the next person we're going to talk about, and he's probably the most interesting, certainly the most versatile character of this period. Sort of Leonardo da Vinci a few centuries before Leo was around. He was an Englishman. He studied at Oxford, very smart. He came across the Franciscan monks, you remember, from St. Francis, vow of poverty and all that. You remember how I also told you last week that the Franciscans, for all the good things, they were not big on higher education. Again, learn your letters, learn your numbers. Anything more is vanity, because this earth that we're living on is a temporary stop. Our focus is on heaven. Bacon admired the Franciscans' devotion, their level of faith, but, of course, his scholarly pursuits were very much at odds with their view of higher education as a worldly thing. Now, again, we've talked about it in the subsequent centuries. The Franciscans have really abandoned that. All you got to do is go to St. Francis University. There are 3 of them in the U.S. But again, Roger Bacon wrote about ideas. He was less a scientist and more of a scientific theorist. And he developed the ideas of light reflection and refraction, which is the foundational basis for laser technology. He invented, more or less, again, the origins of these are sometimes fuzzy, but he more or less invented the magnifying glass and, by proxy, the first eyeglasses. His principles were used to develop the world's first telescope 300 years later. He used his sharp mind to self-teach about the languages of the Bible. So he studied and learned Greek, Hebrew, Aramaic. And he spent years studying those, believing that the scriptures could be better understood in their original languages. Bacon had more. He was a lover of mathematics. He thought almost anything could be explained with numbers. He believed God was the source of this system of perfection. He saw math as a system of perfection. That is to say, 2 plus 2 equals 4 all the time. There's no way anything, it is truth. And he saw God as the source of all this truth. Very interesting way to look at God. Again, a very left-brained approach, the idea that this God who is so wonderful is not only the source of all life, he is the source of all truth. He also was the first to write about the possibility of sailing west from Europe and finding yourself in China or India. He did not know, obviously, about the existence of North America, but again, he was the opposite of a flat earther. He saw the world as round, and he just sailed west far enough from Europe. By gosh, you're going to come up over here in China and Japan. He also had an understanding of astronomy, of the calendar. He was a scientist who discovered that the calendar they were using was off by a few days. He also had a grasp of what gunpowder could do. This guy was a doggone genius, up one side and down the other. Despite all that, the field in which he was probably strongest was mechanics. He predicted the use of cars, airplanes, motorized boats, submarines. Again, he was a theorist, but he drew upon his understanding of mechanics and explained how this could be done someday when everything else catches up. The concept of this type of travel, of this type of technology. Again, he did develop, magnifying glasses, eyeglasses, but he also, again, his brain was so sharp, he theorized about all these other wonderful possibilities. And really, as much as anybody else, Roger Bacon was the source for what we call the scientific method. That idea, again, steeped in reason and logic, where you take a hypothesis, test it, retest it, and then reach a conclusion. Again, completely divorced from what you want the facts to say. You follow the facts wherever they may lead you. This inductive method, some people call it, but the scientific method is what we call it. And again, it is just a very reasonable approach to discover scientific truth. He did not perform a lot of experiments himself. He was more of a science philosopher, like I said. The Pope, though, read a lot of his works at the time, Pope Clement IV, and he asked Bacon to send him samples of books he was writing. This Pope was very intellectually curious, and wouldn't you know it, they preserved a lot of Bacon's writings, and by God, it was the foundation for the first known set of encyclopedias. What a legacy Roger Bacon had. He began to condense, right before he died, he tried to condense all of his stuff into a single work called Opus Majus, larger works it's called, and it is basically, I mean, it's not hyperbole to call it the foundation of modern science. Roger Bacon was a spectacular human being. Again, the Franciscans with whom he aligned, and with he took the vow of poverty and and performed whatever rituals were required. They were concerned that again, they were not too keen on higher education, and here living in our midst is a very big product of higher education. They were very concerned. They actually sent him into exile for 15 years, not a prison, but just as a way to slow him down, more or less. We don't know how he lived during those 15 years, but we do know that he was released before his death, and that he spent his last years writing the Opus Majus. And for all of his wisdom, for all of his knowledge, for all of his insight, for all of his truly innovative thoughts, Bacon argued that science would never be able to save man from sins. So we get to that old Christian debate, faith or works. Do you faith yourself into heaven? Do you work your way into heaven? People are still debating that. It is a great debate. But for Bacon, despite all of his knowledge and everything that he could explain, he concluded, I think correctly, that science is not going to be able to save you from your sins. You can't think your way into heaven. You can't score 100 on the test and get into heaven. It is by faith and faith alone. Roger Bacon, one of the most remarkable human beings of all time. We'll talk more about him and the rest of the stuff on Monday. Have a good weekend.